I think every ministry leader and perhaps every Christian I know recognizes that that's a really big word, discipleship, and that central to the Great Commission is this command that Jesus gave us to make disciples. And so, since it's such a big deal, since it's at the core of who we are and what we are to be doing with our lives, it makes sense to me that we would be willing to assess, that we would be very concerned with whether we are doing a good job at this, whether we are doing it right, whether we're doing it in such a way that it's producing fruit. And so I think that it's legitimate to ask these kinds of questions, and it's not in any way to judge or be critical, but to make sure that we're being effective, that we're bearing fruit. So how are U.S. churches doing? If not, how is my church doing? How are we doing? And why do we think what we think? Why do we think that churches are either doing well or doing poorly? Really it comes down to that question of, are we willing to assess? Are we willing to assess? And as I have read, as I have done research, as I have interacted with pastors and churches and missionaries and professors and authors on these subjects, I believe I've come to the conclusion that there are several indications that change and renewal are needed. And so I want to just show you some of the data that I've come across personally, and this is certainly not all of it, but it's just some good indications of why I believe that change and renewal are needed. So first of all, this is from Barna Research organization, and if this is all we had, and I think a lot of people do kind of function with this picture in mind, is that 3 out of 4 Christians or Americans identify as Christians, and so we're doing great. Everything's good. But when we scratch the surface and kind of look at what exactly we have in that 73%, we find that it's way kind of overestimating fruitfulness. So this figure on the right, the American religious landscape in 2020, this is the Pew Research Center Institute. And you can see there that white evangelicals make up 14% of the American population. And we'll look a little more closely at evangelicals in particular in a little bit, but this shows that it's not exactly, a clear indication of fruit. Just because 73%, 3 out of 4 Americans identify as Christian, doesn't mean that we're talking about actual fruit here. So this chart very much matches with the research that the Barna Group did as well. I just want to point that out because they really do coincide. So roughly 25% or so will consider themselves unaffiliated, or they don't know, or they didn't answer, or whatever. And the rest are religious, almost all the way down the list there. The rest are religious. A very small percentage actually are, outside the umbrella of Christianity. But anyway, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. Just you can see though that a lot of these are very very ill-defined. even white evangelical doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking here about true disciples of Jesus. But Mormons are lumped in here. What exactly, can we say about Black Protestants or other Protestants of color? What does that mean? How would we categorize these as far as their discipleship? Well, this chart shows that we're progressively becoming more and more unaffiliated. So if we looked at a chart like the one I just showed you from 1986, only 10% would identify as unaffiliated. And so now the numbers up to 2020 are very high for 18 to 29-year-olds. That number of unaffiliated is growing quite steadily. Even amongst the older population, that number is rising, but especially so you can see there in the 18 to 29-year-olds. So this is a long-term kind of thing. A lot of people will say that, well, 18 to 29-year-olds have always kind of been unaffiliated. They've always kind of, sowed their wild oats and left the church for a time, but they always come back. Well, they're not coming back in the way that they have in the past. This shows that there's a lot of activity, and a lot of Christians are really participating in discipleship kind of activities. Almost half of Americans are practicing Christians. I should say the dark gray stripe there is practicing Christians who are attending Sunday school or fellowship group. That's, we can debate how encouraging or discouraging that is, that 43% of practicing Christians are attending Sunday school or a fellowship group. Or studying, 33%, 1 out of 3 are studying the Bible with a group. 1 out of 4 are reading and discussing a Christian book with a group. 17% are meeting with a spiritual mentor. This is actually not entirely discouraging information here about discipleship activities, but discipleship activities don't necessarily help us measure the fruit of our discipleship, the effectiveness of our discipleship, but it is somewhat encouraging. Here we have a generational sea change in religious affiliation, and won't spend a lot of time here. This is similar to the other chart, but it shows that the younger generations are progressively more and more unaffiliated. And even the older populations are decreasing in their association with religion in general. So, we all know that there's been decline in the church. There's been decline in numbers, if you will, but that is only going to increase. This unaffiliation is only going to increase as time goes on. And so these problems, I believe, need to be addressed. Now, let me just share with you a handful of sources that I have come across. And again, this is not everything, but these represent a good kind of a variety of things. So first of all, this book by Barna, The Seven Faith Tribes, really looked at the religious affiliation of Americans, and they came across the similar data to what we just saw, that a large number, something like 80% of Americans identify as Christian, but Barna broke this down into casual Christians versus captive Christians. And when actually when you look closely at this and you really look at the answers that people gave to the 9-point criteria that Barna gave for defining born again Christians or evangelical Christians, you find that really only about 8% of Americans were able to give biblically literate answers. Let me explore this just a little bit here. This is a couple of quotes from the Barna website, just helping us understand how they categorize people as either born again or as evangelicals. So they write that born again Christians are defined as people who said they have made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that is still important in their life today, and who also indicated they believe that when they die, they will go to heaven because they had confessed their sins and had accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. Respondents are not asked to describe themselves as born again. The only two criteria that he used there was that they had made a personal commitment to Christ that's still important to them, and that they believed that they would go to heaven when they die. That was it. That was the definition of born again Christian according to Barna. Then evangelical is a little more rigorous, and this is what I was talking about, the points that indicate that really only about 8% of the people who identify as Christians fall into this definition. Only about 8% were able to give biblically literate answers. So here's evangelical. Evangelicals meet the born-again criteria described above, so personal commitment to Jesus Christ and believe that they're going to heaven, plus 7 other conditions. So there's your 9 total conditions. Those include saying their faith is very important in their life today, believing they have a personal responsibility to share their religious beliefs about Christ with non-Christians, believing that Satan exists, believing that eternal salvation is possible only through grace, not works, believing that Jesus Christ lived a sinless life on earth, asserting that the Bible is accurate in all that it teaches, and describing God as the all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect deity who created the universe and still rules it today. So, being classified as an evangelical is not dependent upon church attendance or the denominational affiliation of the church attended. Respondents were not asked to describe themselves as evangelical. They simply needed to agree to these 9 conditions, and that's where that data comes from. And again, only about 8% of people were able even to, agree with those 9 points of faith. This book, Almost Christian, the subtitle there is What the Faith of Our Teenagers is Telling the American Church. This book has really been influential for me personally because I spent so much time in youth ministry. But this book really revealed that the fruit from a lot of emphasis on youth ministry has really not produced the kind of fruit that we youth pastors would have loved to see. But this is basically what they discovered, was that the majority of students who've been involved in youth ministries have shared beliefs of moralistic therapeutic deism, a term that I forget who made it up, but this is what they discovered. Okay, and that's simply put, someone who believes that a God exists, who creates and orders the world and watches over life on earth. Number 2, that God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. Okay, we can work with that. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God is not involved in my life except when I need God to resolve a problem. And number 5, good people go to heaven when they die. So you can see that it progressively becomes less biblical in its emphasis. But that study was massive, and it interviewed many kids who came out of youth groups. And so that is a clear indicator that our discipleship through youth ministry has not been as effective as we would have wanted it to be. Now, Edward Farley's book, Theologia, I include this because his emphasis was on theological education. His emphasis was on the training of pastors and professors and theologians. And this is what he said about his discovery. So he said, today, theology has become a mastery of academic disciplines for the purpose of professional ministerial preparation. In the past, theology was understood as, I love this, the orientation of the soul for the purpose of acquiring wisdom, which all men and women need regardless of their station in life. And so what he's saying is that our theological education has, and I think this is because it has been largely disconnected from the local church, it's become, as he says there, professional ministry preparation rather than wisdom, rather than the orientation of the soul for the purpose of acquiring wisdom. And it's also become something that really the only people who need theological education are the pastors and professors, but most people in our churches really don't believe that they need it to any real extent. So his findings have been very, it's almost as though the research that Farley did and others in that conversation regarding theological education, what they really discovered is that the training of pastors and professors actually has a direct effect on how people perceive ministry and theology, and therefore it has really in many ways affected the fruitfulness of our discipleship. It's something that professionals do. So this book, The Juvenilization of American Christianity by Thomas Bergler, provides a really interesting kind of history here. So he may have made up this word, the juvenilization of American Christianity, but this is a brief kind of summary of the timeline that he provides in this book. He goes back to the 1930s and he shows how the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War impacted the church. He talks about how dozens of new youth organizations hoping to protect young people from the evil effects of these crises, were developed, and these were largely parachurch rather than church ministries. And this is kind of the root of things. So then in the 1940s, he talks about the birth of the teenager, how this word was first used sometime in the 1940s. And national youth culture emerged during this time through music, TV, movies, products, and cultural beliefs. And it really reshaped the experience of growing up and adult perceptions of that process. And we really didn't have a gap between childhood and adults, in a real formal kind of way. Until the 1940s. 1950s, youth and youth culture hit the American mainstream in a big way. Crucial similarities remain in the structure of adolescent life and its relationship to the church. And this just continued on. 1960s, we had all these upheavals that intensified the process of juvenilization and expanded its reach to more believers and churches. Mechanisms by which teenagers influenced church life were now well established, and adolescent versions of Christianity began to make serious inroads among adult Christians. In other words, the way that churches started to minister to teenagers became the norm and expectation in the churches at large. And so post-1960s, some traits of Christian maturity have been decoupled, he says, from adulthood in post-1960s America. And this change has encouraged juvenilization in churches. Indeed, it is likely that the juvenilization of American Christianity and the emergence of the new immature adulthood have mutually reinforced one another. So As the culture made this shift, the churches shifted to accommodate it. And then that accommodation of the church seems to have actually encouraged immaturity in the culture at large. That's his point. So very interesting book, but also again just a kind of it's very helpful in that it provides kind of a history of how we got where we are in today's culture and how that has impacted the church. This study, National Study on Disciple Making in U.S. Churches, is something that I've referred to quite a bit. This was done in March of 2020, so it's very recent. And this is a summary of the results from that study. First of all, they found that fewer than 5% of churches in the U.S. have what they call a reproducing disciple-making culture. Probably most churches would say we are making disciples, but what they found here was a lack of disciple-making cultures. So they say that we champion and celebrate these churches. They are a model for other churches. But at the same time, in light of the truth that disciple making is the core mission of the church, the study found a disappointingly low percentage of churches with a culture of and strategy for reproducing disciples and disciple makers. So fewer than 5% of churches really have, in their estimation, a real healthy emphasis on disciple making, and really to the point where their culture is built on disciple making. This finding is about an absence of churches reflecting viral like disciple making movements. That's something, you can read that and we can talk about that later. This was one of the most important findings, I think, is that there's a lack of commonly understood definitions. There is not a clear, compelling, and commonly understood set of basic definitions for terms such as discipleship, disciple, and disciple making. This makes it very difficult to assess effectiveness within local churches and within the broader church community. So, in other words, consistent definitions do not prevail in Protestant churches in the USA. And I think this is a huge problem. What is a disciple? How do we make disciples? How do we know when someone is a disciple and that they have become a mature disciple? How do we know what the goals of discipleship are, and so forth? I think this is a really big deal. They also found that pastors are overly optimistic in their assessment of the disciple-making cultures present in their churches and frequently overrating their effectiveness in discipleship and disciple-making. I believe that that's been true of me, possibly still true in some ways, but I think that these last two, the lack of commonly understood definitions and the tendency for us to overestimate how well we're doing, that combination is pretty difficult, and that brings me back to that belief that we need to be willing to do a serious assessment of ourselves and to really ask ourselves why we believe what we believe. Why do we believe that we're doing well and that we're having impact? And that kind of assessment is uncomfortable and can be overwhelming when we start talking about, well, so what do we do? So if we find we're not doing a great job, what do we do? So this is just really a handful of resources that indicate that change and renewal are needed. And I think this is just an important starting point for becoming better at discipleship and becoming better disciple makers and really developing discipleship cultures in our churches.